We'd like to give a special shout out to the following people for making this episode and the rest of Act 3 possible: Louis, Malaya, Reg, Daniel Athern, Osterkim, Vanna, Finch, Dr. Dan Venning, Sleepless Berry, Court, Rogue Canoe, John and Muna, Sadie, Zay the Great, Elliot Kane, and Trident. Thank you for your support. Maraming salamat.
You're listening to Hainai by Motzie Dapul. Episode 51. Manfred, a Hainai short story.
For the longest time, Manfred D'Arce believed he had nothing to fear. And why would he? He was not like any other man, apart from those he considered colleagues and allies in the Ordo. He was a chosen elder, and fulfilled a purpose, a greater calling than lesser men, who lived and died ignorant of the true great heights humanity could achieve. It was easy enough to believe, in the course of his long life, that he was worthy, and so too those of his ilk. It was, to him, a great truth that he would hold to, even when things began to fall apart. Savard's disappearance, of course, was the first sign, but the unrest had been brewing for some time now. Manfred had not been close to the younger Langford, though he had considered himself good friends with his elder brother Friedrich. Naught was said of how young George, beautiful, cherubic, like an old master sculpture come to life, bore no resemblance to any Langford in their line, but Manfred knew better than to dig into family mysteries, lest his own name's scandals come to light. When the three, Grigori, Renard, and the younger Langford, attempted their coup and failed spectacularly, almost nothing was left of the three, and Savard himself, through his loyal right hand, concocted a narrative of three drunk men pitching themselves off a bridge on a stormy night. A clean, sensible death, with no bodies to recover, washed out to sea. Manfred called upon the Langford household after the tragic accident, and found the master of the house, Friedrich, a husk of a man, clothes torn, hair lank, red-eyed and unshaven. When he was not giving short, terse answers to Manfred's attempt at conversation, he muttered to himself, the same configuration of words, spoken through quiet sobs. "Beloved," he cried, "sweet George, my love, my poor love." It disturbed Manfred to his core, and he would remember Friedrich's sunken eyes long after the man himself passed, withering away from grief within the year. Manfred had no strong opinions regarding Marianne Weeks. Some of his colleagues looked down on her, but that never made sense to him. She was of their standing, even if her family was nouveau riche, and in his mind, if the great genius of art welcomed her into his inner circle, she must have had great potential indeed. by her end, she had designed more spells than any other elder, which was why her end was so shocking in the first place. It was not explained to the rest of them how an immortal elder might die like a mortal man. And yet, the possibility chilled Manfred to his core. Had someone gone after her? Had a grudge against her? She was one of the inner circle, so she was powerful indeed, so how could someone kill one such as her? And if anyone could at all, it would have had to have been another elder. The idea frightened Manfred, not simply because it would take a powerful elder indeed to dispatch one like Marianne Weeks, but also because it meant that Grigori, Renard, and Langford were not a singular, extremist anomaly. It meant that the honorable, chosen elders were succumbing to the base, grasping greed of lesser men, that they were no different than the thieves and the liars, the criminal elements that plagued Toronto the Good. It was a thought that he could not bear, and though he was wrong about the fate of Marianne Weeks, his fears were more than founded, though perhaps a wiser man would have seen this outcome long ago. The straw that broke the camel's back, and the last of Manfred D'Arce's faith, was Clarence Thompson. Clarence Thompson was the best of them, in Manfred's mind. His father was a baron, and he himself a civil servant. He was a good father and husband who loved his family well, and was a well-respected member of the Ordo and of Savard's peers. He had mastered certain elemental magics, that of heat and cold, though he excelled in the latter. He could make frost appear on glass, freeze limbs off trees, and summon such heat that he could start fires without tinder, though he did not have the mastery Savard had over fire itself. For the most part, he said in good humor, it was useful in keeping his home at the perfect temperature, and ensuring he never ran out of ice for his brandy. He was a proud man, and when Savard disappeared, he was one of many who claimed succession, for Savard had not appointed a successor. It was, however, clear who was most poised to take leadership, given that Savard's two remaining members of his hand-picked inner circle had joined forces and invited other elders into their fold, promising to uphold Savard's own principles. A few came eagerly. A few were given concessions. Manfred was himself uncertain, until he spoke at length with Richard Henry, and then the benefactor himself, and understood their cause to be a righteous one. Clarence Thompson had refused to meet with him at all, proud as he was, though Manfred believed the man to be wise despite that. He was no lost cause. Perhaps all he needed was a friend and peer to appraise him of the men's true goals, and the ways in which they aligned with Savard's own vision for the future. They were, after all, hand-picked by the man himself, even if one of them came from nothing. Surely, if Savard himself were still present, these were the men he would trust most, with keeping order among his elders. Such was the belief Manfred held in his mind as he sought his old friend, who had secluded himself in some remote cabin of his, which he often retired to in the winter months, for thoughtful quiet away from the bustling city, and his own peace of mind. Thompson didn't seem pleased to see him, as such, but he welcomed him regardless. Perhaps Manfred's new alliances had soured him to the man, but when they sat and drank for a spell, Thompson seemed to gain back some of his good humor. He seemed to have nobody to serve him there at the cabin, nobody to accompany him from his family. Yet it was clean and warmly kept, insulated from the winter chill. Thompson seemed grateful for the company Manfred provided, however uninvited. He was in good enough spirits that when Manfred began to speak of the benefactor and his right hand, Thompson didn't immediately send him away.
"You've come all this way,"
he said,
"to sing the praises of an upstart."
"He is our best chance," Manfred returned, "to be as we were under Savard."
"And what if,"
said Thompson grimly,
"we were stifled under Savard, much too meek, unable to pursue our true potential?"
This took Manfred aback. Without Savard, they would not have this potential at all, and Thompson knew that as well as anyone. At his look, Thompson smiled, then chuckled, as though he had played some grand joke, and stood to refill his drink.
"You are a comfortingly honest man, my friend,"
he said, clapping Manfred on the shoulder. A sudden thud shook the floor, and Manfred jumped, looking around to find the source of the sound. Thompson laughed again.
"Out in the woods, everything makes such noise. You learn to sleep peacefully after a while."
They were humble lodgings, to be sure, but Manfred managed, sleeping in a guest room made up for him on short notice. It was, at least, the warmest room in the cabin, with furs hanging from the walls and taxidermy lining the shelves. If he was a more superstitious sort, Manfred would have felt disturbed to be surrounded by the bodies of the dead. But he was a man of science, even if the sciences he engaged in were supernatural in nature, and so drifted off to sleep, with assurances of his own sanity, that even the strange, periodical banging from somewhere within and without did not rouse him. Deep into the night, he awoke, throat dry from the winter air, and though his fur-filled guest room was well insulated, the rest of the cabin had taken the winter's chill. He could hear the wind battering the cabin from the outside, the shrill whistle of a snowstorm, promising a difficult journey back to the city. He did not have the wherewithal to ask Thompson where he could get some water, but did not wish to wake his gracious host, and began to check each room in silence, with only a dim camping lantern to see by. There was another bang, and Manfred stopped in his tracks, realizing it came from one of the wooden doors, many of them shut, but this one uniquely barred. Against his better judgment, Manfred lifted the bar and cracked the door open. What little he could see in the darkness revealed a basement, with stairs leading down, and Manfred gasped, seeing pinpricks of light at the bottom of the steps. Eyes, bright and wide, and little hands, too little, reaching out. But they were wrong. There was something wrong, and Manfred only realized after a sharp breath that there were not enough fingers on each of those hands. Even in the shock of his discovery, Manfred kept his wits about him, enough to put the wooden bar down gently, so as to not wake the cabin's other, sole, he thought, inhabitant. He took his lantern and stepped carefully down, and heard shifting movement. He heard a groan, dry, cracking, nigh inhuman, and then another. A chorus of lamentation that he had never heard, but his eyes stayed focused on the eyes and little hands, until he saw at the foot of the stairs a child, unkempt, dark, eyes like stars by the meager light of his lantern. When he looked around, he saw the rest, human shapes, but grotesquely gaunt and bony, what little clothing they had hanging off unfed frames, hair lank and lost in clumps. There was blood still fresh on some, and dried on others, and one man, Manfred saw, had a leg that was gray and blue, hypothermic by his untrained eye, though the rest of his body still had natural color. He shushed those who began to cry out, reach for him, though they could not get far with parts of their bodies chained to the wall. He knelt in front of the child, though there was more than one, and counted 7 fingers. Everything felt sharper in this moment. The cloud of sleep was long gone, replaced only by the revelation of what he had discovered, and what decision he must make in that moment. People, he counted 15 heads, though there were figures and shapes he could not identify by the lamplight, some of them children. In their eyes, he saw the purest, most primal fear. They flinched away from him when he raised a hand to examine them. The first child was reluctant to allow him to touch their hand, but he understood exactly what he was looking at when he had a closer look. The blue of the man's limb, the manner in which this child's wounds were closed. Cauterization from a significant source of heat. It was freezing in this basement. Manfred ached to return to the warmth of his guest room, pretend this was all a dream. That was when he heard movement from above. The shifting of a bed, the groan of wood. He picked up his lantern and looked around, wished to say something, but even now, his throat was tight and dry, and words would not come. No words could possibly encompass the horror of this place, this crime to which they had been subject. Only action could do now. Manfred returned to the first floor and replaced the bar. A bleary Thompson found him in the kitchen, fetching himself some water. He had already sent his message, but he knew it would take time, not for it to be received, but for the benefactor to find this place. Even with the shadow stepping he learned and mastered of Bartolotti, he could not simply come to a place he did not know and had never seen. Manfred only hoped it was not too late, and that he could keep up his good humor as Thompson greeted him the next morning. There was something in the blizzard. The storm had only grown worse, and Manfred was so overwhelmed by his own distraction that he did not notice Thompson's, until the man, looking out the window through the frost, asked him,
"Do you feel that?"
Manfred did not at first. Too troubled was he by the thought of what was below him, that he did not know what caught Thompson's attention. But the more attention he paid, the more he felt it. Like a great, terrible thing. Closing in, suffocating. There was something in the blizzard. Thompson began to instruct him, stricken by fear, to gather supplies. They would, he said, burn the cabin down if another elder had come to kill them. It was common practice now to try and snatch power from others if they were not protected. He spoke of important experiments he did not wish to fall to the wrong hands. Experiments, he said, of fear, of the foci and their power, of true names. As he gathered his things, Manfred took the electric lantern that he had used the night before, heavy in his hands, and struck his old friend across the back of his head with all his strength. The first strike was enough to incapacitate, but Manfred did not stop striking the bloodied skull until he was sure Thompson was dead. He would not stay dead for long, of course. They were elders, after all. But it gave him ample time to gather the strange furs from his lodging and bring them to the basement. He broke the chains of those still living, gave them furs to warm them, and gathered the littlest child into a pelt in his arms. Told them that something was come to kill them, and that they must flee. He saw blood on the wall, marks like a spell that he could not quite read, but he paid it no mind. Such research disgusted him, as much as the man they stepped over when they got up the stairs. With all the firms and warm clothing they could take, they braved the blizzard, slowly but steadily, with Manfred heading south to where he knew the road to be. He had come by an off-roader, though it would struggle through the snow, and he knew that those he led would not survive in this cold. He felt a prickle along the back of his neck, the suffocating, frightful thing they had run from, and left Thompson behind to face. He did not know what it was, only that it was powerful, and it felt like blood in the air smelled. Manfred was deathly afraid of what was coming to that cabin, though he could not explain why. He thought briefly of Savard and the warnings he had provided long ago, when they were all still attuned to his wisdom. The long winter, he said. Manfred had felt it over the years. His powers sometimes running into interference, like electrical signals bringing static to radio and television. Stronger in certain places, weaker in others. And in the long winter, an unease and uncertainty. It was, for the most part, an inconvenience. But the way Savard had described it, well, a long time ago, their former leader went on an expedition, traveling north with a crew and 2 elders who accompanied him, to uncover secrets about their magic and unlock their potential, even as they enjoyed immortality itself. When he returned alone, with less than half the crew he had traveled with, and the only elder left to tell the tale. The long winter, he said. They should take caution, he said, for there were things in the winter that even he, a leader of elders, feared. But Manfred, safe, comfortable, and happy in Toronto, obedient to Savard's precautions and not one for venturing beyond the city, or experimenting in this strange and frightening season, had never truly known what Savard meant. Not until this moment. There was something in the blizzard. Manfred startled the next morning when someone knocked on the window of his vehicle. They had piled in, limbs tangled and shivering, Manfred's own magic keeping them warm when he found the battery drained in the frigid cold. He did not sleep, could not, even as the pain groans and troubled murmurings quieted, and he stared at his own reflection in the window. He wiped the fog from the glass and saw a hooded figure, gasped when he saw the familiar face of the benefactor, and he struggled to roll the window down even as he held his charge, the 7-fingered child who slept in his arms that night. His young but powerful leader used his shadow-stepping to bring every one of his charges back to the Ordo's meeting place, instructing Manfred to have Richard Henry call them ambulances, bring them to the hospital. He would remain, he said, to find Clarence Thompson, punish him for his crimes. It satisfied Manfred to know that justice might be served, and he stepped into the shadows and found himself safe, back in Toronto. Later, the benefactor told them all what happened, and why they must remember to fear the long winter, as Savard had warned long ago. This was what he saw. Long before he ever stepped foot into the cabin, he saw it in the distance, in the lingering wind of the blizzard. There was something there, a striking figure, stark against the white snow and brown wood cabin. He did not know what it was at first, but as he stepped closer, he saw it. Crimson, almost black, shining in the light and staining the snow beneath. Stretched out like he had been tied to a cross, but without a thing to hold him but his own frozen limbs, was Thompson, or what was left of him. Skinned alive, muscle and sinew red and black as poppies. His skin remained at his back, strips of it frozen solid as tent poles to keep him upright, or tying him in position. His eyes were rolled back, his jaw broken, contorted into a final scream. It was an unnatural death, the benefactor said. It could not have been done by human hands or elder magic. The power it would have taken. In his eyes, when he spoke, Manfred saw an unspoken truth, that the benefactor regretted not killing the man himself. But here now he stood, telling them that something great and powerful, frightening and dangerous, resided in the long winter, as Savard himself had warned them so long ago. It was a satisfying thought, like the winter itself sought to punish Thompson's great, unnatural sin. But it was not a foregone conclusion. Was it a punishment for Thompson himself? Or was it something that would come one day, for all of their ilk? For what did Thompson do, beyond building upon theory that Savard himself had already put into practice, attempting to replicate his work, create his own foci? If Manfred had stayed, would he have met the same fate? For the longest time, Manfred D'Arce believed he had nothing to fear. But that time was done. For even among their chosen elders, he had seen the worst of mankind. He was no longer blinded by the delusion of great men, nor the great purpose they aspired to. And he knew. He had felt it. There was something in the blizzard. And Manfred D'Arce was afraid.
You're listening to Hainai by Motzie Dapul.
Hey everyone, this is Reg Geli, co-creator of Hainai, and back on the credits. Hainai is a podcast produced by Motzie Dapul, Yoy Halago, Alisa Jimenez, and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. This episode was co-produced by Jesse Goodsell and written and directed by Motzie Dapul, who also plays the role of the narrator. If you'd like to chat with other listeners when this episode goes live, we do a live premiere every other Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or Toronto time on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/HainaiPod. To help support the production of Hainai, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/HainaiPod. You'll get to be part of our early access program where we release episodes 3 days early on Thursdays at 9 p.m. EST or Toronto time. You can also get bonus video, audio, art, and so much more. Speaking of Patreon, of course, we'd love to give a shout out to the following patrons for all their amazing support. Alan Weberman, Megan, Nanette Dapul, Jesse Goodsell, Talin, Amelia Brownstein, Anna, Astra Kim, Becca Terrier, Diana Cause, Dracu Card, Emma Halig, Evie Smith, Faye Fungi, Jess Snow, Josh the Alchemist, Maddie Remijo, Malaya Light, Matthew Upton, Melissa, Mika, Pablo Neurotic, Sabine, Sean, Sharon Peplinski, Sukes, and Victoria Goodwin. You guys have been so amazing, and we're forever grateful to you rock stars. If you can't subscribe monthly, you're a rock star too. And you also have the option to buy us a milk tea on coffee.com/HainaiPod. That's ko-fi.com/HainaiPod. Our ad-free Hainai album, which has our official music and full episodes from Act 1 and 2, is also available in both Patreon and the coffee store. Check out our website, HainaiPod.com, for more news and updates, and don't forget to follow us on our blog, HainaiPod.tumblr.com, as well as our socials, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at HainaiPod. Hainai is available on Acast and wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, if you've actually been listening all the way up to these credits, you may have noticed that, well, one, I haven't been doing the credits lately, but more importantly, number two, I did not credit myself as co-producer for this episode. That's because I no longer am. As we announced on our live stream last Feb 15, or Feb 16 for those in the Philippines, I'm no longer a part of the Hainai team. If you've kept up with us from the start, you know that I am also juggling this podcast with a career in medicine, and unfortunately, the work has caught up and juggling is no longer possible for me. I have loved working on this podcast and meeting everyone, so yes, I am back on the credits today, but just to say goodbye. However, I am still a part of the podcast as co-creator, plus I'll still be on the Discord lurking as I do, and I still am the voice of Ira, so, better watch out for any surprise appearances. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Motzie, the team, and all of you, our supporters. It's been the most wonderful ride. I'll always be watching and rooting for this podcast. So, for the last time, thank you, we love you, and hanggang sa muli.